The Yellowstone fires of 1988 were an enormous media event beyond the catastrophe that they were. Now, if you were alive at that time and old enough to read a newspaper or watch television, you will remember very likely. It seemed as though the whole world were on fire. Now, 1988 was also a year in which there occurred an unusually strong La Nina event. A La Nina is at one end of a climatic oscillation that affects the water temperature in the Pacific Ocean, especially along the equator. At the opposite extreme of this climatic teeter-totter is the El Nino. The El Nino brings heavy rains. The effects of these climatic fluctuations are strongest near the equator, as are the effects of yet another oscillation, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. Any archaeologist working in Peru knows that these oscillations have been in sync with the rise and fall of a great number of sophisticated civilizations there. As one archaeologist I know has put this, during severe El Nino events, people thought that the gods were raining hell on them and resorted to very extreme measures to appease the gods, including human sacrifice. You can think of the Pacific shoreline in Peru as ground zero for climate cycles driven by seawater temperature differences. But these climate cycles affect weather all the way to the southeastern United States. Climate change is complicated, but clearly such cycles are becoming more extreme. The severe effects of the 1988 La Nina is associated with the extremely dry conditions that produced the Yellowstone fire decades ago. And today, we should ask ourselves what lies ahead. I would like to welcome you to this webinar. My name is Douglas Comer, and I'm president of the United States National Committee of the International Council on Monuments and Sites, also known as USICAMOS. I would like to welcome Cam Sholly, Superintendent, Yellowstone National Park and World Heritage Site, and Douglas Smith, PhD, Senior Wildlife Biologist, Yellowstone National Park and World Heritage Site, who will talk about this, and they will have a very intriguing and informative presentation, and I welcome them.
Good morning. It's a privilege for us. We're getting started a little bit late. National parks aren't always known for their great connectivity, as you probably know, and Yellowstone is no exception. Doug and I are looking forward to having a conversation with you this morning about a full range of different aspects of Yellowstone and past challenges that we face, successes that we've had, and kind of what the future looks like and how we can all work together to protect this incredible global icon moving forward. I'm fairly certain that most people know where Yellowstone is located, but it's in the northwest section of Wyoming. It transcends 3 states, Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming, but about 96% of it is in Wyoming, about 3% in Montana, and about 1% in Idaho. Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem constitutes around 20 million acres of land. The core of that ecosystem is Yellowstone, which is about 2.2 million acres. Everything that we do in this park, the decisions that we make, whether that be in regards to wildlife or visitation or some of the other topics that we'll discuss, affect the rest of the ecosystem. And conversely, decisions that are made in the ecosystem itself have major impacts on what we do here in the park. And so nothing that we do can be done alone. It's got to be done in partnership with others. Partnering is an essential part of the success that we've enjoyed up to this point, and partnerships will help us substantially moving forward as we take on the challenges of the future. A couple stats here for you. We've got half the world's geysers in this park. We've got about 11 native fish species, 220 bird species. This year, well over 4 million visitors will be in the park. Our average over the last 5 years has been about 4 million. We'll talk about that. At peak, we have about 750 Park Service employees, another couple thousand concession employees that are in the park, about 450 miles of road, 1,100 miles of trail, 845 historic structures. We're privileged to work with 27 associated American Indian tribes that have strong cultural and heritage ties to Yellowstone. We have about 1,000 volunteers on any given year, and we have a substantial number of mammals, plant species, and that type of thing. So this park, constitutes a full range of geologic, natural, cultural resources, something that we can all be very, very proud of, and something that is very, very important for us to protect and maintain into the future. Yellowstone turns 150 years old next year. This is a huge milestone for not only obviously Yellowstone, but also for America's national park system, Yellowstone being the first national park. We've learned a lot over the last 150 years. We've learned in many ways that we haven't always gotten it right. And we've done a good job of putting the pieces of this ecosystem back together. And when you look at the National Park Service mission, as outlined in the Organic Act of 1916, which created the National Park Service, you've got a mission that is in some ways contradictory. I think it's one of the most noble missions in the world, but it's an extreme challenge to balance the conservation, the protection, the preservation of some of the most incredible aspects and resources in America, at the same time allow for their enjoyment by hundreds of millions of people throughout the country, and do it in a way that leaves them the resources unimpaired for the enjoyment of future generations. The term conserve, as was intended by Congress in the Organic Act, really meant protect. So we won't get into kind of the modern evolution of definitions of conservation and preservation and that kind of thing. But generally speaking, the definition that we use from a conservation preservation perspective is if health is the capacity of an ecosystem to renew itself, conservation is our ability to protect and maintain that capacity. And that's extremely important. The enjoyment aspects of these resources and conservation and preservation are predominant. That means they're the most important to us. In other words, if we don't get that right, then there is nothing to enjoy. And so, the service over its last 105 years has worked very diligently to try to achieve that balance. We don't always get it right, but we work very hard to maintain these resources in a way that the American public and the global public can enjoy. Unimpaired means, in general, we want to keep them in as good a condition or better for the enjoyment of future generations. So we don't make decisions that regress the progress that we've made in protecting these incredible resources in the national park system in America. 100 years ago in Yellowstone, even with national park protection, we basically extirpated nearly every predator in the park. Doug will talk more about this in regards to wolves and cougars and grizzly bears and things like that. But we basically wiped out every wolf in this park in the 1920s. We decimated the bison herd down to less than 25 animals. 50 years ago, and that's not too long ago, we were feeding bears out of garbage dumps in the 1960s. And so we've worked, as I said, very diligently to put the ecosystem and the pieces of the important components of the ecosystem back together to the best degree possible. We have a bison herd now that is nearly at record levels, over 5,000 animals. Doug will talk about wolves, which have rebounded significantly. The same with grizzlies and cougars. And we've balanced out the ecosystem with the return of many of these apex predators. But we also have a considerable amount of challenges in front of us. And so when we think about the progress that's been made over the last 100 years and health-wise, the ecosystem currently is probably in better condition than it has been since Yellowstone became a park as far as the health of species in this park. That doesn't mean that we've succeeded and that we can just sit back and enjoy our success, because there are incredible challenges in front of us, not only here in Yellowstone, but in parks across the system. As I mentioned, everything that happens externally can affect what happens internally and vice versa. Most recently, Montana and Wyoming, Montana and Idaho have implemented new hunting and trapping rules and regulations in regards to wolves. These are management changes in those states that could have and likely are having and have had in the past impacts to the success that we've seen in the wolf's case in Yellowstone. One of the most important conservation success stories in the country, but a potential threat, a very real potential threat of reversing some of that progress if we don't pay close attention to it. Climate change is by far the single biggest threat to Yellowstone's ecosystem, something that not only do we need to better understand and respond to, but we've got to do it in a different way today than we have ever in the past. We need to know and understand what are the things that we can control and mitigate to protect the species and the ecosystem health in this park that are under threat from climate change. What are the things that we can influence together with our partners, with all of you, as climate change continues to threaten Yellowstone? How do we take and how do we determine what are the actionable things that are going to have meaningful differences in relationship to climate change moving forward? Those are all, we know we've done a lot of monitoring. We all have a lot of data about climate change. What we really want to try to do, not only in Yellowstone, but across the system, is really identify those areas where we can take specific actions, where we can look at modeling and understand how to better respond to the threats of the future. You see a lot in the press about record levels of visitation in the national park system in America. Visitation across the system went up by about 50 million people from 2013 to 2018. It's well over 300 million. I suggest this year could be a record for the system. It will definitely be a record for Yellowstone. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And then we have many tangential correlating threats like invasive species that are a substantial threat to Yellowstone, either introduced by humans or introduced due to changes in climate that are serious threats to the ecosystem moving forward. We'll chat a little bit about that. Look at visitation here, a trend in Yellowstone since the turn of the century. And, you see it peak in 2016 at about 4.2 million is where we were. And that was the Park Service centennial, and that was the record year for visitation. 1948 was the first year. Yellowstone became a park in 1872. 1948 was the first year that Yellowstone had 1 million visitors in the park in a single year. 1965 was the first year we had 2 million people in the park in a single year. 1992, 3 million in a single year. 2015 was the first year we had 4 million in the park in a single year. We went backwards about 200,000 visitors between 2017 and 2020. COVID has substantially changed and accelerated visitation patterns in the park. Beginning last August, we had record visitation nearly every month out of the last 12. And we project as a visitation level in 2021, somewhere between 4.5 million and 4.7 million. And so this park, and like other parks, we don't have the luxury of what we've had in the past, where we've had 10 or 15-year spans of time in between increases of the next million visitors. It's possible that within a very, very short amount of time, a couple years, we could increase and surpass 5 million visitors in this park. And that by itself represents a large number of challenges for us. This is a little bit of a mess, but I want you to pay attention to it. This is just the last 3 years. We'll call 2019 the last year we measured visitation in a normal way, pre-COVID. That's the orange line. And you can see that the busiest month of the year has been and continues to be July. And then one thing that's changed over the last several decades has been visitation being pushed out into the shoulder season. So whereas we used to see visitation largely between, say, Memorial Day and Labor Day, over the last 5 to 10 years, September now is busier many times than June. And we're seeing visitation arrive much earlier in April, May, and stay much later into September and October. The blue line is 20. And so remember, orange is 19. These are vehicle entries into the park. You can see that somewhere around early July last year, the blue line overtakes 2019. So even in the year of COVID, we had some of the busiest months and record months in history. And that lasted, and yet that trend line goes all the way out into late in the fall. And then 2021 is generally mirroring 20 from a vehicle entry standpoint, but we have a difference this year. We had no international tour buses in last year. This year we have tour buses, so that visitation is actually higher than what is reflected here in vehicle entries. But the point is that we've got substantial challenges in front of us from a visitation standpoint. But I want to put something in perspective for you. The blue is the undeveloped portion of the 2.2 million acres of Yellowstone National Park. The green, the 0.29%, is every single road, parking lot, pullout in the entire park. The vast majority of visitors to Yellowstone never get more than a half mile away from their car. I did 208 miles in the backcountry last year in this park. And once I got a mile off the road, in that 208 miles, I counted less than 20 people. And so we have a very, very large problem in a very, very small percentage of the park. We spend enormous amounts of time and energy and money in that small sliver of the pie here. We're recalibrating a lot of what we do to focus on impacts that increasing visitation is having on the resources within that portion of the pie. We're looking very closely at what impacts are there to staffing and operations and infrastructure. This park has not had nor has any park really in the country had a substantial operating increase to their operating budget since 2010. So generally speaking, we're dealing with around the same staffing levels in 2021 with 4.7 million visitors as we had back in 2010 when we had less than 4. And so at some point that becomes a problem. And people don't think about visitation impacts on infrastructure and staffing as much. It takes people to manage people. Think about if you have 2,200 garbage cans in this park that have to be emptied 5 times a day instead of 3. Think about 600 bathrooms that have to be cleaned 6 times a day instead of 4. Think about, you know, the impacts on wastewater treatment facilities if 1 million more people per year are flushing the toilet 5 times per day. Those are all very real impacts that we are looking at in relationship to increasing visitation. That isn't necessarily a correlation from increasing visitation to some decimation or substantial impact or negative impact on the health of the overall ecosystem. And so, you know, we want to make sure that we put things into context and that we're focused on the areas that are the most important given the threats and the challenges that we have. The other thing that we focus on in that small sliver and in the park in general is visitor experience. What are our visitors thinking? What kind of experience are they having? This park in 2018 did the most comprehensive visitor use survey in the Park Service's history. We surveyed 7,000 visitors. They got iPads. They were tracked throughout their visit in the park. And what we found was, contrary to what we thought we would find, is that the large percentages, upper 80s, low 90s, of visitors that come to the park, despite the traffic jams and the congestion and that kind of thing in certain areas, were good, had a good to excellent experience. That survey has given us plenty of data and areas to focus on, but it's something that we're constantly monitoring and how we can do better from the standpoint of visitation management. The last thing that we're really focused on in that strategy for visitors, you know, so we had impacts on resources, impacts on staffing and infrastructure, impacts on visitor experience, and then what are the impacts on gateway communities? And that could go, you know, what's the recreational access impacts? What are the economic impacts? What are the impacts that, you know, at West Yellowstone, for instance, when traffic backs up 2 miles into the town? We work with a wide range of gateway communities very closely to try to balance that out. You know, I think that everybody's seeing the crowds in Yellowstone, the traffic jams. While we have a lot of work to do, unquestionably, I think there's a conflation that occurs where people see a traffic jam and you immediately think there's too many visitors. Remember, 70% of the visitors to this park are first-time visitors. Most of those visitors have never seen a bison in the wild or a grizzly. It's not their fault the Park Service didn't build shoulders on the roads. And so when they see that bison for the first time or that grizzly, they're going to stop their car. They're getting out, they're enjoying that moment. And it's up to us to manage that. But there should not be a conflation of traffic jams necessarily with, you know, a crashing of the ecosystem. On climate, real quick, I'm going to give this over to Doug here, and you can talk more specifically about some of the wildlife. You know, this chart, if you look at this last June from the standpoint of precipitation, you can see 2021 against some of the different averages, extremely low. Some of the driest conditions that we've seen since the 30s. For the first time in my 3 years here, we had to implement fishing restrictions due to warming water temperatures in rivers and low water levels in rivers and streams. And this is something that is highly concerning to us and something that we should all be thinking about for the future from a climate standpoint. I think this is a very compelling map to show over the upcoming 180 years how the climate will be for Yellowstone. And so if you look at mid-century of this century, you know, Yellowstone can see and can expect temperatures to be similar to what you find in northern Utah. By the end of this century, temperatures that would be similar to what we see today in southern Utah. And you can see where over time, you're going to have substantial changes in the temperatures, in the climate, and the dryness. And that is something for us all to focus on, not only here in America, obviously, but globally. And massive numbers of major impacts, all of you know, for longer fire seasons, hotter fire seasons, impacts to various species that rely on, white bark pine, for instance. We have no shortage of things to talk about and to address in regards to climate. And so it gets to what are we going to do for the next 150 years to address some of these challenges? And we've set 5 major priorities in Yellowstone. We call these kind of umbrella strategic priorities. And you can see them here. We can talk about them, but one of the things I want you to understand, the first priority we talk about is focus on the core, and that is a workforce priority. Yellowstone doesn't manage itself. You've got people like Doug Smith that have been in this park for 25 plus years, expert, one of the finest wolf biologists in the world. There are similar experts in this park that help us make the right decisions, help us manage the ecosystem, help us manage visitors. But if we do not have a good workforce, a satisfied workforce, then we're going to be in major trouble moving forward. And there are all kinds of things that we need to do to focus on the core and do a better job of not only retaining the very best talent. I mean, you want the best of the best working in Yellowstone. And so we've got to do whatever we can to retain the best talent in this park and recruit the best talent in the future. Strengthening Yellowstone ecosystem and heritage resources kind of speaks for itself. We don't want to go backwards. So we want to protect the progress that we've made, whether that be in geologic, natural, cultural resource areas. And we want to properly, as we just discussed, identify what the threats are on the horizon and take actions proactively to protect this ecosystem into the future. Delivering a world-class visitor experience, once again, that transcends a wide range of different areas, looking at the different expectations of the visiting public, how they want to experience resources, what types of advancements in technology and expectations do they have, how do we balance creating a great visitor, a world-class visitor experience for our visitors at the same time, once again, protecting the resources of this park, investing in infrastructure, that small sliver, hundreds and hundreds of miles of roads, and with that comes paving and bridges and parking lots and structures. We have an incredible amount of work going on in this priority. We've got the largest historic preservation project occurring in the country right now, thanks to the Great American Outdoors Act. We're making hundreds of millions of dollars in investments into infrastructure, which is good. That doesn't necessarily address what I talked about earlier from the operational needs that we have to increase staffing and that kind of thing. And then we're working really closely to build stronger coalitions and partnerships with our tribes, with our gateway communities, with our states. Those are, counties, communities, nonprofits, the public, absolutely essential to helping inform us how we can do better and how we can work collectively to protect this global icon together. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Doug, and he's going to crank through some slides here quickly and give you an overview from his perspective on the success stories that we've had, maybe some of the challenges that we're facing, especially in regards to wolves and grizzlies and cougars. Doug?
Hello, my name's Doug Smith. I'm a wildlife biologist working in Yellowstone. I was hired to reintroduce wolves and manage the program since. I've since picked up other duties working with elk and birds. But what I'm going to talk about today, Cam's talk is very comprehensive. I'm going to bore down in on a few wildlife species specifically because they have outsized impacts on ecosystem functioning. And those are wolves, cougars, and grizzly bears. We also have black bears, but we really don't have a designated program on them like we do grizzly bears. And these animals are very important, and I'll just be very brief here, because they help structure the ecosystem. And as Cam said, they were wiped out. Yellowstone was established 1872. 44 years before the National Park Service was established in 1916. And Yellowstone was really established for its scenic, really odd values, the geysers. And, no ecological system has perfectly straight lines in a square. And so it was set aside because this entire area was a howling wilderness for those geologic features. But setting aside something early that's never been logged, grazed, mined, or otherwise influenced, which is pretty much the rest of the lower 48, has had tremendous value to wildlife. Yet, Yellowstone was not undisturbed. In fact, it was highly manipulated because the Park Service wasn't formed to 1916. And even after that, what our vision was not clear. Park Service planners and administrators wrestled a lot of the 20th century was what are parks for. And a lot of the early parks, Yosemite, Grand Canyon, Mount McKinley, now Denali, Glacier, Rainier, were established because they were places that had scenic beauty and you couldn't use them for any place else. But Yellowstone was established early. You can see it anchored here in brown. Cam went through it, and the green around it is public land. Grand Teton National Forest, 2 wildlife refuges, and some view this as the most intact temperate zone ecosystem in the world. I'm leaving out Arctic and tropics, but the most intact temperate zone, and that has outsized values. Next slide, please. Can I advance it?
It's not letting me advance for some reason now.
Okay.
Hang on. Victoria, do you have control? There we go.
So this is a view of part of Yellowstone Lake overlooking Yellowstone, and a fundamental question that the U.S. National Park Service had to ask in the early part of the 20th century and now is a scene like this missing its native constituents. And as Cam said, we eliminated wolves, we eliminated cougars. Those are the top 2 carnivores in North America. Bears were reduced, but saved because an early administrator liked them, which shows the power of personality. But we also went after lesser carnivores like coyotes, wolverines, bobcat, lynx. So does something that looks like this, beautiful, seemingly untouched, pristine, but lacking all its native constituents, is that us doing our job as we should? Next slide, please. It was a howling wilderness early on. This is how people view parks. You need to come here and have fun. Protecting ecosystem functioning was not high on their list. Next slide, please. And Cam showed this. Predator control was our mindset early on. There were good animals and bad animals, and animals that were bad were predators. They killed the good animals, the game animals that we wanted. So right off the bat, predator control was the policy in Yellowstone. Around the park was market hunting, the fur trade, the North American ecosystem was being changed. The only thing that really protected it was remoteness and low human population density. But Yellowstone was set aside early, and so were some of the national forests around it. Next slide, please. And this is exemplified perhaps in our most iconic president, Theodore Roosevelt. This is not a criticism of Theodore Roosevelt. I've met his great-grandson, talked with him all afternoon in my office, and what was in the white circle that's not showing up here is TR called wolves the beasts of waste and desolation. And I had to ask his great-grandson, would he think that now? And he said no. He probably would have revised his thinking. And that's what we're trying to do. Wolves aren't that bad. Cougars, other predators aren't that bad. And so we're trying to expose this mythology through good information. But this, Theodore Roosevelt, turn of the last century, this was the mindset of everybody. Predators were bad. Next slide, please. And so this is the range of wolves originally. The eastern Mississippi is a different species of wolf, red wolf. I won't get into the taxonomy, but they were essentially everywhere. Next slide, please. And this is what we did to them with Yellowstone in the red rectangle. So we moved their range back. This was based upon the manifest destiny idea. European colonization had the right to do this. The three primary things moved aside were wolves, bison, and native peoples. Next slide, please. So first and foremost, grizzly bears, which arguably is what makes Yellowstone, in terms of its wildlife, the most famous. In fact, people coming to visit Yellowstone, in terms of wildlife, want to see top three is always grizzly bear, wolves. Sometimes it's bison, sometimes it's moose. But grizzly bears are very, very popular. Great range reduction since European colonization. And you can see here in the late 1950s, early 70s, we were around 200 to 300 bears. The low point of the population was 1974, 136. Now we've rebounded up to possibly over than 1,000, which is still a small fraction of their original range. But this has been a conservation success story. It was hotly debated on what to do. All of you are probably familiar with the Craighead research at the University of Montana. They contested many Park Service policies about the dumps, and that was resolved and studied. And now we've restored bears to the point where they've never been before. So this has been a real conservation success story. Next slide, please. Cougars, they're the tough ones. They were eliminated. We did not reintroduce them like wolves. They came back on their own, but you never see them. You rarely hear them, and they're silent. We have not had continuous monitoring of cougars like we've had grizzly bears and wolves. There have been 3 periods of cougar monitoring. The first one was right before wolves. We reintroduced wolves in 1994. Some prescient thinking people said, let's get in here and look at cougars at that time before wolves hit there, because wolf-cougar interactions, being the 2 top carnivores in North America, is dynamic and important for ecosystems. So cougars were just getting established in the late 1980s. They kind of took off in the 90s. That study stopped. That was led by the famous Morris Hornacher, who really pioneered cougar research in Idaho in the 1960s. Another study took off in the late 90s through early 2000s. This is a period of time where cougars pretty much had colonized most of northern Yellowstone. Cougar densities are very low throughout interior Yellowstone. And then in 2014, led by a colleague of mine named Dan Staler, the Park Service took over monitoring of the cougar population. And what's very important about this is cougars have probably fully saturated northern Yellowstone. Their densities are on par with wolves. And this area of northern Yellowstone is one of the most carnivore-rich areas in all of North America. And so you can see the population size there in the graph. This is just northern Yellowstone, but up around 40 cougars in 1,000 kilometers squared. Next slide, please. And so the issue is when you eliminate all the carnivores, reduce them to almost nothing, and remember, bears are primarily vegetarians, but they do prey on elk calves and deer fawns in the spring. But pretty much most of the carnivores were eliminated. What happens? And so we had an exploding elk population. And this really was our wildlife issue of the 20th century. And so the Park Service decided to control the elk population because many people criticized the condition of the range. And this is an example of what the elk were doing in the middle part of the 20th century. It was primarily impacting the woody vegetation. Grazing was very different. In fact, grazing, the intense browsing might have increased the productivity of the landscape. But between 1923 and 1968, depending upon what source you read, and Doug Houston's book, Northern Yellowstone Elk, is probably the best, about 77,000 elk were removed either through Montana hunters when elk crossed the line, or they were shipped to areas where market hunting had eliminated elk across the Western United States, Canada, and Mexico, or the Park Service killed them themselves and sent them meat to Native American tribes. Next slide, please. So without predators, this is what you get. This is middle of the century Yellowstone. Next slide, please. And this is what you get too. You take out the predators, you've got to control the elk yourself, or the values that Cam talked about that makes a park a protected area, you lose because the wildlife populations get out of sync with their natural fluctuation or natural size. Next slide, please. So wolves, I mean, it's hard to overstate their controversy. I'm colleagues with a tiger biologist in India where tigers actually kill people. He visited Yellowstone and said wolves are more controversial. Everything with wolves is outsized. Yellowstone is one of the more prominent parks in the world. You combine wolves with Yellowstone, it's big news. But there was a debate. Would wolves get here on their own? Expert opinion was they wouldn't. So we chose to reintroduce them, which was very controversial. You're cramming these animals down our throats. We partnered with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, used the Endangered Species Act, wrote a recovery plan, and reintroduced 41 wolves between 1995 and 1997. Next slide, please. Very famous photo. That's the Secretary of the Interior in blue, Bruce Babbitt, the late and first female director of the Fish and Wildlife Service in brown, carrying the first wolf in. This was hugely interesting to people, hugely controversial, headline news across the world. Some refer to it as the greatest conservation story of the 20th century. Next slide, please. And this is one of the first wolves brought in. This is wolf number 7 from Alberta. We had operations in Alberta in 1995, 14 wolves, British Columbia in 1996, 17 wolves, and then 10 more wolves from Northwest Montana in 1997. This wolf here, because she settled the landscape in the early years, is one of the most productive wolves we've documented. 25 pups to yearling age. Next slide, please. And so this shows population growth. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but as you know, a lot of wildlife biology is quantitative analysis. But if you just eyeball this period we're calling phase 1, population size of changing rapidly. This is primarily due to disease. And then this period has been very stable. We're calling that phase 2. So the population of wolves has kind of gotten into equilibrium with their food source. Next slide, please. Wolves are territorial. They divide the landscape up, don't tolerate trespasses, although they do occur. But you can see large areas that are blank on the map where wolves have not settled, because Yellowstone is primarily an elk summering ground. Elk come in the summer, gain condition on the lush, nutritious forage, and then leave the park in the winter, and wolves need year-round prey. And so those are the places where they can't settle and subsist. Next slide, please. But this is the controversy, and Cam referred to it. Wolves prey on elk, and elk are iconic in the Western United States. They're one of the primary hunted species by hunters. Yet it's important to note that across Idaho, Montana, and Wyoming, there are more elk now than were reintroduced. And even more importantly, human harvest on elk now is higher in all 3 states before wolves were reintroduced. And the 3 states together have over 2,000 wolves. So the debate is not really data driven. It's politically driven based on people's attitudes. And this has been a very hard situation to deal with, as Cam mentioned. But keep in mind, Yellowstone has all those visitors he talked about coming. It generates $660 million of economic activity each year, 7,000 jobs. 60 million of that is due to wolves, and hundreds of thousands of people see them each year, and they come here just to do that. It's one of the few places in all of North America you can do that, Canada, Mexico included. And so a few hunters benefit by killing a handful of wolves, and our wolves are not wary of hunters. So it's not fair chase hunting. They tolerate humans viewing them. Those hundreds of thousands of visitors in Yellowstone, they tolerate them watching them at 100 or 200 yards. They walk outside the park, that's a great rifle shot. So a few people benefit, and hundreds of thousands of people are deprived of a national park experience. Next slide, please. And so this is the fluctuation of the elk herd that I told you, that 1923 period to 1968, human controlled, then the population increased, and then it declined because of carnivore recovery. And this has been very hard to communicate to the American public, where you have to explain less is more. That's a very hard thing to explain to people. But the lower elk population is probably more ecologically appropriate than having elk at carrying capacity was there is environmental damage to the range. This has been a very hard thing to communicate broadly to the public. Next slide, please. But it's a sensation. As Cam mentioned, people see bison here. People see grizzly bears here. This is the wolf jam that I was flying over a couple years ago. Wolves were spotted, and this is what people do. People crave real experiences now. In our world of parking lots and plazas, as Cam mentioned, they come here to see real nature and connect with it. That's deep within us. That's happening in Yellowstone. Most national parks, you can't see grizzly bears and wolves on the side of the road. And so the public has craved that. So this is really a wrestling match between values along the boundary that we have. Next slide, please. Here's winter. The roads are closed to wheeled vehicles. You have to do over snow vehicles. People still run into wolves. What kind of experience is this? It's life-changing. Next slide, please. The 2016 issue of National Geographic magazine, in the first time of the magazine's history, was dedicated to one issue, the Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem. And so this impact that Yellowstone has on America and the world is outsized. Whole issue on Yellowstone, the battle for the American West. So as Cam said, these issues are evolving and ongoing. Next slide, please. And so what that means is compromise. And there's been a lot of social science work. This is beyond the work of wildlife biology, but to have wolves, you must kill them. Now that's not in the park. That's across the states on other public lands, private land. And the balance between, in other words, killing and protecting is a tough balance. There's work that makes people feel that if you can kill wolves that take livestock quickly and swiftly, and if you can harvest wolves, it makes people willing to live with them more, to accept them, to tolerate them. But this is a pendulum that swings back and forth, and finding that middle ground has been immensely difficult with wolves because of all of their historic mythological baggage, literally worldwide. This goes on in Europe, Asia, Middle East as well. And finding that middle ground is supposed to be difficult. And we're struggling with that now right on the Yellowstone boundary. Next slide, please. This is that debate. As Cam mentioned, the loaded word conservation, which means wise use. And in the National Park Service sense, he chose to use the word protected in parenthesis, but preservation means no use. And we're the only land management agency in the United States that's got preservation as a mission. Everybody else is conservation, wise use. So those things are difficult to manage at the boundary. Next slide, please. So this is our progress. This is what we've done with wolves. You can see the Mexican wolf down there in New Mexico and Arizona. The red rectangle, Yellowstone is anchoring this. Yellowstone also anchors this because we're high profile. We have a platform that is picked up worldwide where we can speak. And so this is very important, not only what we do in Yellowstone, but outside because of the platform we use to help conservation. Is that the last slide? This is and these two large carnivores are interacting. And to some degree, wolves have helped grizzly bears in a poor food year. Grizzly bears steal wolf kills. Next slide. I think I'll skip past this because I'm probably running out of time.
I think we're gonna go ahead and get to the end here because we've got. I know we kind of started late, and I want to make sure we've got some time for questions. Really nice job, Doug. And I know we got started 10 minutes late because of connectivity issues. So super good overview. We can get to questions. If some of you have to drop off, we apologize for cutting the time short a little bit. I want to show this video. Doug talked incredibly well about wolves and cougars and grizzlies. Those were the first bison from Yellowstone that cleared brucellosis protocol and were transferred up to the Assiniboine and Sioux tribes up at Fort Peck in August of 2019. As bison have rebounded to 5,000 or so animals at this point, you know, we're working on substantial large landscape conservation priorities with tribes. About 60% of the bison population has a disease called brucellosis, which can induce abortions in cattle. About 20% of the elk population has brucellosis. We've worked closely with Department of Agriculture and the states to develop a protocol that puts these bison through a 2 to 3 year basically testing process to clear them. Once they're designated as brucellosis free, they can then be transferred to American Indian tribes. This group of bison here has already been transferred to tribes as far east as New York and as far west as Alaska. This is an amazing step forward in taking the pure genetics of Yellowstone bison and putting them on tribal lands for cultural purposes, and something that we're very proud of. We are about to invest another $1 million to expand this program even more and to establish a much more robust pipeline of bison through the system. We're going to stop there since it's already 11 here in the Mountain Time Zone, and turn it over Douglas or Victoria. I don't know who wants to do a Q&A session for Doug and I, but we're happy to answer any questions anyone has.
So that would be me. Cam, can you hear me?
You're a little bit hard to hear, Destry, but go ahead.
So thinking about ecosystem scale beyond the boundaries, could you say a few words about the so-called Greater Yellowstone Ecosystem and the collaborations that you have and your predecessors have had with Forest Service and BLM and Fish and states to think holistically about the ecosystem? And along with that, and this is kind of a tangent, but has the COVID pandemic induced economic changes around you, like more housing development, people moving out of cities and into rural areas, and that relates to wildfire suppression and so forth. So the big picture of that would be helpful.
Yeah, so I'll answer your last question first. I think you see that across the country. You can look at the real estate markets to see people getting out of urban centers and moving. I think I saw something where Bozeman, Montana was per capita had the highest growth anywhere in the country at some point over the last year. It's a major challenge and something that is not a trend that's really predictable, Destry. And I think that it's something that I know the gateway communities in the states are very concerned with, something that we work with them on. The way that it affects us from maybe a micro standpoint, but something very important is we don't have housing available because of the cost in many of the areas, because the housing market's gone up so high. You know, public servants that are working on a $30,000 or $40,000 a year salary can't find rentals, can't buy houses. And so that's helped making us shift kind of our strategies around that focus on the core recruitment retention on what types of housing options are available. No question that as we see the longer fire season impacts, you've got more development in areas in and around the GYE. That's a very real threat, something that we've all experienced. I mean, this summer, I'd say for at least 2 months, the park was just inundated with smoke from wildfires in Montana, Idaho, Washington, and California. A variety of different impacts there. We put out 15 fires in Yellowstone immediately this year. In regards to the larger GYE, I mean, we have a Greater Yellowstone Coordinating Committee, which has been around since the 60s. That has included the 2 national park superintendents of Grand Teton and Yellowstone, the forest supervisors from the 5 national forests that surround these parks, BLM representation, Fish and Wildlife representation. As the chair of that group currently, I invited the states of Idaho, Montana, Wyoming onto that committee because a lot of the decisions that we were making, conversations we were having, have to do with wildlife management, transboundary conservation priorities. We'll see how that goes. You know, the Forest Service manages habitat, for instance, but they don't manage the wildlife. You've got species that are on the endangered species list, like the grizzlies, that are managed generally by the Fish and Wildlife Service. And there's a lot of conflicts there about delisting and that kind of thing. Wolves are, as I said earlier, under threat. What we hope is that we can have collaborative conversations that include our state partners because they play such a significant role in the larger transboundary and cross-boundary conservation. But we have a lot of work to do there. And whereas we, I think, are on the same sheet of music with our federal partners, there are fairly major differences in some cases in conservation approach between the federal government and the states.
It comes an understanding. When we started the seminar today, Douglas mentioned the fires in '88 in Yellowstone. I was out there before, during, and after those fires as part of the Greater Yellowstone Recovery Corps that did a lot of work on erosion control and trail rebuilding and so forth. But in the post-fire years, you know, at the time there was a lot of rhetoric. You know, some of it "burn, baby, burn," and some of it, you know, "sky is falling, the world will come to an end." But say a word about the recovery and the management of the forest today, not counting the climate change threat to fires, but how has the park changed as a result of the '88 fires and up to the present?
Well, I don't think anybody would have thought that burning 1.1 of 2.2 million acres in one single year in 1988 would have been good for the park. The reality is that was a buildup of almost a century of fire suppression. Everybody understands that fire plays a very important ecological role. And I think that, you know, when you look at the areas of the '88 burn today, you know, it was in hindsight very, very beneficial in many ways for Yellowstone. It's all cyclical though. And what we're faced with now is as fuels begin to rebuild, and our goal being to support and use fire to support ecological benefit of the ecosystem, at the same time, where we might do controlled burns early in the year when there's plenty of precipitation and there's not a danger of a controlled burn turning into a major wildfire. We were so dry in June, we could barely do any controlled burning. We were in a situation where we look at each individual fire that starts in Yellowstone, and we analyze that against a risk assessment to determine what values might be at risk, what ecological benefits might there be, and then most importantly, what kind of resources are available to fight the fire if that becomes necessary. And in this year's case, it was so dry that we went into an immediate suppression policy, basically starting in early June, and did not let any fires burn across the landscape. The detriment to that in the future is we're kind of repeating the buildup into 1988. And so what we've taken on now is we're in the wildland urban interface, which is you know, where the forests basically come into contact with the developed areas and historic resources and things like that. We've taken a very aggressive stance at reducing fuels in and around historic structures and other assets that we want to protect. But it's going to be interesting over the upcoming decade in relationship to how much fire we can put on the landscape for ecological purposes versus what type of approach we take from, you know, having to put fires out because the conditions are too dry and it's actually too dangerous. And we probably don't want to set up a situation where we burn half the park in a single year in the future.
So in the '90s, when I was in the Interior in the Park Service, what was called the New World Mine was perceived as a major threat, and in fact, the World Heritage in Danger label was put on it by UNESCO. And I'm wondering, and there was an awful lot of hype about that on both sides, fear of black helicopters and blue berets descending on the park to take over and that sort of thing. But I'm wondering if those kinds of large-scale threats to the park, when they come up, and they seem to come up from time to time, is there a benefit to the park from your point of view of your being designated a World Heritage Site and therefore in the spotlight, not just in the US as the most iconic park, but around the world as, the first national park? And does that label of World Heritage Site or the label of World Heritage in Danger affect your approach to dealing with those crises when they come up?
Absolutely. And we have one right now. I mean, the crevice mine, there's a proposal to do mining fairly adjacent to the north boundary near Gardner here. We're working with partners and with nonprofits to try to negotiate that. But I think any type of designation like that bolsters people's appreciation and improves our ability to demonstrate to the public the value of these places. And even though there's a boundary line, as I said several times, impacts of mining, especially, we just delisted the Soda Butte Creek, which was contaminated back in the 50s and 60s, and basically wiped out all of the fish and aquatic resources in Soda Butte, is now probably one of the best cutthroat trout fisheries in the entire park because of that recovery. What we don't want to do is go through that again. And so being able to analyze when these threats along the boundary, whether it be hunting wolves, that Yellowstone wolves that cross the boundary and get killed, or potential mining that can have substantial impacts to from a runoff standpoint to the Yellowstone River, or other impacts. Every designation that we have, whether it's, Yellowstone is an icon by itself and has incredible national park protection. But I think the more designations and the more powerful it is to the American and the global public when it comes to trying to defend against some of those actions that may take place right outside the boundary that may affect what we're doing inside the boundary.
You've been generous with your time, you and Doug Smith, Dr. Doug Smith. We appreciate it. I think we'll bring the webinar to a close. Thank you very much. And Douglas Summer will close this out.
All right, thanks, Destry. It's good to see you. And thanks to everybody for giving us some time here today. We really appreciate it. It's a privilege to talk to everyone.
Take care.
I want to thank everybody for attending this webinar. And I have to say, the kind of research, the studies that are going on at Yellowstone are so important and so cutting edge that they could, I know that they would benefit many other World Heritage Sites. I was speaking to someone from Ngorongoro Crater and the Serengeti the other day, another World Heritage Site in Africa. They have the largest concentration of predators in Africa. And so talking to them about the need for the predators, suddenly the light bulb just went off in this person's head. And I have to say, he's really anxious to receive some of your studies that are very, very relevant to the issues there and lots of other sites. So, obviously what you do is important to this amazingly iconic site. It's a world treasure, no doubt. But what you do is also going to be very, very important as you get it out there to the rest of the world for their protected areas. So thank you so much. It was a real pleasure to meet you, listen to what you had to say, and talk to you in the rehearsal the other day too. I would like to encourage the folks who are watching, if you're interested in supporting these kinds of efforts, our real focus this year in ICOMOS and US ECOMOS is climate change and the connection between heritage and climate change. Please do tune in, continue to tune in to our webinars. We're going to have our annual conference and symposium on the 27th and 28th of October. So please check out our website. We're going to have presentations from World Heritage Sites around the world having to do with environmental issues and the connection between the environment and heritage. Come to our website, please, to get more information. And also, if you're so moved, feel free to join us. Thank you so much, and really looking forward to seeing you all again in person, I hope, one of these days, but for now, virtually. Thank you again. Thank you so much.